Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Charles Ogletree, and we'll be discussing two of his book projects, All Deliberate Speed, Reflections on the First Half Century of Brown versus Board of Education, and From Lynch Mobs to the Killing State, Race and the Death Penalty in America. Welcome to Rip Rap, Charles.
Jim, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
This is such a fantastic opportunity for Rip Rap. Both of your books are really interesting and give a unique perspective on civil rights in the last half century. And we're so pleased that we can talk with you about your work. Also, I must say that I was amazed as I took a look through these two book projects at the depth and breadth of your intelligent, informed, and committed work in civil rights over the decades. It actually is, indeed, a very humbling experience for me personally. As you know, there are people who talk about doing things, but you've been there and done it. So I'd like to start our conversation today with the notion of community, since that seems to shape all of your involvements, whether these are within the context of family, faculty member in the academy, the legal profession, your many additional interests, or putting together those who cultivate the discourse for a book. I noticed that you are a very alert observer who works closely, carefully, and with great insight and empathy. And so I thought the story of your father and his hat is very revealing of the way you work. Perhaps you share that story with our viewers now.
I'll be happy to, and thank you for, again, your compliments. These two books are bookends. All Deliberate Speed is about civil rights and the context of race, and Lynch Mobs to the Killing State is about the criminal justice system, so it's the civil and criminal system. In All Deliberate Speed, one of the most difficult and yet important chapters I wrote was about my father's coming alive, in a sense, as a black man in America. And the hat story is one that when people read the book, they send me letters and notes because it resonates with them, others of their own families, their own experiences. What happened was that my father was a very humble man, worked his entire life, grew up in Alabama, didn't finish the 4th grade, had no formal education. And I think, I didn't realize it at the time, but that always was a point of embarrassment. When I was graduating from high school, he was there for the high school graduation. When I went to Stanford for college, he was scheduled to come, he didn't show up. And a last-minute excuse. And I thought nothing of it because things could happen. When I graduated from Harvard Law School, he didn't come. My mother came, but he didn't come. And they were separated then, but he was still very close to the family. And then, when I was being sworn in as a lawyer to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1983, he planned to come. He and my mother were going to fly out. He's going to meet his brother, who he hadn't seen in 40 years, since they both left Alabama. He called me the night before and said, Junior, as he called me, I can't come. And I said, oh my God, here it is again. Here's the last minute excuse. I said, why can't you come? He says, I don't have a hat. I said, what do you mean you don't have a hat? He said, I don't have a hat. And he said, he'd bought a suit, he had a nice suit, but he said he didn't have a hat to travel with. That meant nothing to me then at that moment except anger. My father's coming up with another excuse. I called a local department store, they took my credit information, and he was able to get a hat. Now what the metaphor is that he was saying, this is an important moment, I'm going to be there with you, but I'm not prepared to be presented as your father. And I started noticing, I looked at Thurgood Marshall when he was a young man, he wore a hat. I looked at Martin Luther King, who wore a hat. It was Malcolm X, all these black symbols. These men, working class men, professional men, wore a hat as part of the complete dress. And I think he's saying, if my son is going to be in the Supreme Court, and I'm going to be there with him, I need to look my best. And not only did he get the hat, but it was a very important moment of pride for me. Here's why it was important. When you think about community and family, This is 1983, and my father had grown up in segregated Alabama. He experienced discrimination. He knew that he wasn't voting then because blacks couldn't vote without all sorts of harassment. He had no connection to the system. In that courtroom from Maryland, I grew up in Maryland, another segregated city, was Thurgood Marshall. The powerful black lawyer, won the Brown decision in 1954, won 29 out of 32 cases he argued before the Supreme Court. First African American on the Supreme Court, and he'd been on the court since 1967. This was his 16th year. But I saw these two men, they were symbolic of what I saw as my role models. My father for protecting me from all the things that could have happened and didn't happen, and Thurgood Marshall for giving me a path of what we can do for justice in the legal system. And it was so powerful seeing them there, but there also was a transition going on. My father couldn't have been happier sitting there looking at Thurgood Marshall. He'd heard about him, he'd read about him, but he didn't know him. There he was, and seeing his son sworn in. And Thurgood Marshall was tired, sort of withdrawn, beaten down, because he'd been fighting a battle for 40 years. And he was wondering whether there would ever be true racial justice. And I could see him at the twilight in his career saying things aren't great. And I could see my father saying it couldn't be better. They're same age, same Southern experiences, same impact with the criminal justice system, the civil rights system, different results. And so for me, that was a powerful metaphor. And it told me, and as a lawyer, I have to take something both from my father and Thurgood Marshall. My father, the pride and humble surroundings and always looking back. And Thurgood Marshall, the commitment to fight for others and always look forward. And those two factors made the hat the centerpiece of that, but it also made me realize that here were two black men who were mentors and role models for me in ways that they would ever know, and created a wonderful experience for me that day.
And literacy is built one-on-one. Someone reading to you, and then you reading back to that other person. Unfortunately, there are such tragic circumstances so that many of these families where mom or dad or whoever, grandma, is trying to get money to put food on the table and help the family survive. So they don't have time for the back and forth that builds reading and writing skills. But other people can help by doing that and acting as a mentor, someone who can practice these literacy skills.
One of the things that I've really been pushing, Jim, is that I'm really trying to say this is not an issue where it's only about race. That is, anyone can be a mentor. You can say, well, I can't do it. I'm a white male. I'm a Hispanic female. No, these young people need somebody who's an authority, who's willing to care and give them some support. And we have to break down those barriers that we only interact with people who are like us. And so I've been out there preaching, saying, go into these urban schools, talk to these kids, you made it, help them make it. And I'm hoping that message is getting across, because it is one-on-one, and we can save these kids. And there's another phenomenon related to it, and that is, the first thing we want to do is blame the parents. And there are a lot of single parents who are raising these children. Blame the parents for Johnny's coming to school and he's not well prepared. Well, because you're asking Johnny's single parent mother to teach him the new math, and she never learned the old math. She can't do it. But there's also a question of responsibility. In studies we've done at Harvard and that are part of the Institute, we see that while there are large numbers of televisions in African American Latino homes, small numbers of computers. So are we letting the television become the instrument for our children's learning, or are we trying to find a disciplined way? And what's cheaper? Computer's cheaper in many senses, but you have to know how to use it. You have to know how to navigate it. You have to know how to make it an instrument to help your child learn. And so we have to do a lot more to prepare parents, particularly single parents, to meet the challenges that your children face, and including the tough love that I've been advocating. My children are grown now. My son, Chuck, is 30, and my daughter, Rashida, is 27. And they hate me saying this, but I say you got to have a longer school day. You might have to have Saturday classes because education is in a crisis. And we can't sit back. If we had a war on poverty, if we have a war on violence, we need to have a war for educational opportunity for all our children because it's sensible. Educate them now, they'll be productive, law-abiding, wage-earning citizens tomorrow. And if we don't educate them now, we're going to be paying for incarceration, 3 meals a day, health care, 24-hour supervision, and it's very costly. So in our own enlightened self-interest, we should do something to help prepare our children for tomorrow.
In my own teaching, I tell my students, this is not a dress rehearsal. You are next. I'll be dying.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm so point about that. I talk about that to young people all the time because the question they always ask for me, Professor Ogletree, when is the Messiah coming? You had, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You had these great leaders. We don't have them. I said, there is no Messiah coming. You are the Messiah. You're it. Remember, Dr. King was in his 20s when he was thrust into leadership. Rosa Parks was a very young woman when she got arrested in 1955. Fred Gray, a lawyer out of Alabama, was their lawyer. He was only in his 20s when he did that. And so the idea that someone's going to come along and rescue us is just completely a romantic notion. And taking responsibility and taking leadership. And I tell my students the same thing. I'm waiting for you to retire me. Push me out the door. You don't ask me politely, but it's your time. And I really mean that sincerely. Of course, I've got energy. I'm going to be around, hopefully for a long time. But the leadership has to come up the ranks, and we have to get out of the way to give these young people opportunity to change our world. And I hope they're listening to us.
In the other book, From Lynch Mobs, you note in the beginning of the book that it's widely acknowledged that there's a connection between lynchings and the death penalty. But maybe you can go over that rationale, since I'm not sure that everyone is quite as aware of that similarity. It's certainly there as a penalty, but it's turned into something different.
Part of it is the arbitrariness, and when people don't understand the concept of lynching. A lynching is an extra-legal, an illegal activity. And what people forget, because we've sort of repressed it in our memory, is that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were thousands of people lynched, most of them African-American men. And it wasn't just a lynching, but it had two important components. One component is that it was everything from whistling at a white woman to some minor infraction. It wasn't for murdering somebody or killing somebody. And so the punishment wasn't proportional to the crime. It exceeded the alleged crime or infraction or lack of social graces. But it also was a public social event. These people who engaged in lynching, this wasn't just the Ku Klux Klan. These were Christian people, God-fearing people who go to church on Sunday mornings, pray to a God, and then take their families out. These pictures show children at a lynching because that person being lynched was not a human being to them. It was a caricature. This was like going to the carnival, going to a picnic, going to a social event. And what happened? No one was punished. Hundreds of people would be gathered around to lynch somebody, and they'd all walk away. They actually made postcards, that is, to send them around to recall the occasion. I went to a lynching today, and that's a part of it. And the lynching happens in a variety of ways now. The metaphor holds in this sense. We still see far too many people who are subject to losing their lives, and many for crimes they didn't commit. And the ironic example is not from Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia or Florida, where these lynching cases emanated from 100 years ago, but in the state of Illinois, a blue state as they call it, a democratic state in many respects. In Illinois in the year 2000, Governor George Ryan, who believed in the death penalty, looked at 25 cases of people who had lawyers who had been arrested, charged with murder, sentenced to death, went to a jury trial, were prosecuted, had judges, had appeals affirmed. And then it wasn't just lawyers, but some journalist students from Northwestern University, some law students. They re-examined those cases, and they found that 13 out of 25 cases they examined of people who've been sentenced to death were completely innocent. I'm not talking there was some technical aspect or it was the wrong person, completely wrong person. And that means that your chances of living or dying are about 50%. That's an absolutely frightening example that you might die for something you didn't do. And that kind of error in the system tells us that we still haven't fixed it. And I'm an abolitionist. I'm against the death penalty, and I come at it with a heavy heart and not without some sense of sacrifice. My younger sister, Barbara Jean Ogletree Scoggins, was murdered in the 1980s. She was a police officer. The case has never been solved. Do I want someone caught? Yes. Do I want them punished? Yes. Do I want their lives taken? Absolutely not. And I never would. And what's amazing that my sister was a police officer, I was a public defender, and we would tease each other that she'd lock them up, I'd get them out. But I know she was the most caring person. She would buy cigarettes, give money, make contacts with people who were in her custody. She respected people's dignity, even though they found themselves in unlawful circumstances. But on the other hand, if someone had murdered me, she would never advocate for the death penalty. And so as a victim, a family member of a murder victim, I do this with a heavy heart, but my point in the book is that taking someone else's life is not the answer. And let's look around the world. We're outliers. If you look at democratic governments, you don't see the death penalty being exercised around the world. What's the best example? South Africa. South Africa is a crime-ridden country. They have a lot of crime. And up until Africans were elected as president, they had the death penalty. And a new court was appointed, and they gave a number of arguments, but they declared a moratorium on the death penalty years ago. And the other statistical point we talk about in the book, which is quite amazing, there is no correlation between a state that has the death penalty and a reduction in crime. In fact, it's often just the opposite. There's plenty of crime in California with the death penalty. There's plenty of crime in Texas with the death penalty. And there is no correlation that having a death penalty reduces or serves as a deterrent. And I am finally convinced, looking at several things, the Supreme Court 3 years ago finally declared that those who are mentally retarded cannot be executed. The Supreme Court also just recently declared that young people on the age of 18 cannot be executed. The Supreme Court, in the picture of Thomas Miller Errol on the book cover, reversed his conviction 3 times in the state of Texas, which kills more people than any other state, because they were saying, we're not here to judge whether or not Thomas Miller Errol is guilty. We can't, because the prosecutor's done so much in misconduct by not allowing black jurors to serve, that violates Miller Errol's rights. And they reversed his death sentence and returned it, saying that you can't prevent black people from serving on juries just because they're black. You have to have some disqualifying factors. So the Supreme Court, as conservative as one might describe it, is a court that's looking with great skepticism to the exercise of capital punishment in ways that don't seem to be rational or constitutional.
As I reflected on this book, I thought that concept of chattel slavery was a fundamental dynamic or framework or context, because there's that disrespect for that person as person.
And there are some who would argue that even if we make a mistake, hey, mistakes happen. Traffic accidents, airlines crash, there are all sorts of mistakes, but how can you take a life and say, well, maybe we were wrong? That becomes part of it. And the chattel property is important because the penalties were so amazingly descriptive of the two systems. White man raping a black woman, that could be a fine or a minor sentence. A black man raping a white woman was death. So it was who was your victim that made a determination. Black woman didn't have any rights, as the court said in 1857 and Dred Scott. They had no rights which whites are bound to respect. So this book does a lot of that research and tells you all the analogies and metaphors for lynching and how that has become not a historical fact but a current reality in terms of disparities in our criminal justice system.
And like you were saying about Governor Ryan in Illinois, it's shocking that almost half of the people on death row were not in fact guilty. But that's reflective of a certain disrespect in the process and procedure.
we
need someone to be the guilty
Well,
party.
it's interesting. Let me say a word about Dred Scott, then I want to say something about the court and where we go from here. This year at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, and the website is charleshamiltonhouston.org, April 5th through 7th, 2007, this academic year, I'm going to have an international conference at Harvard on Dred Scott. It's the 150th anniversary. And I'm going to examine that case from all of its different points of view. That's what the Houston Institute does, looks at these issues of race and justice. We have Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer will be there, other prominent judges and lawyers. And that's going to be a major event to examine where we've come in 150 years is one. The other point is that the courts are important, judges are important. When I was talking to audiences around the country in the year 2004, before the election, I had two predictions. One turned out not to be accurate. My first prediction, which was not accurate, is that I expected sometime in October 2004, before the election, the October surprise, that just before the election, that Osama bin Laden would be captured in the basement of the White House. Now that didn't happen. I was wrong about that one, right? I was wrong about that. But my second prediction was that that whoever's elected president in 2004 would probably have the opportunity to appoint 2, 3, or 4 Supreme Court justices that would change the legal terrain for decades. And in the short time since the 2004 elections, in 1 year, President Bush has been able to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices. And he's going to be in the White House for at least 30 more months. So that means 2.5 years, at least to about two and a half years to think about who else to appoint. And I think that's going to be very important because that changeover could happen in end of 07, sometime before the election in 08. And that means the court will continue to change. And that means voting is important. That means registration is important. That means judges are important. And that means that we all, the citizens. And I don't know, John Kerry didn't do a great job of defining his judicial philosophy. George Bush, to his credit, did. He said, I'm going to appoint justices like Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia. And he did. Chief Judge Justice John Roberts and Justice Samuel Alito are conservative, highly credentialed, but in some sense predictable. And that's why it's so important. So where do we go from here? It really requires a sort of a vigilance to the idea of democratic principles, a commitment to really one person, one vote, a commitment to local government, that people should not just be complaining about the mayor or the governor or the city council members, but to get involved in it, to run for office. It should be involved in fixing the school systems. We need to stop moving away from the problem and confronting the problem. It's nice to live in the suburbs, but it's also nice to be a part of a larger community to help. We also need to figure out how to think about enlightened self-interest, that if we focus on more people getting college degrees than getting committed to prison, it's in our own self-interest and the benefits will be enormous. At the Houston Institute, I'm trying to get my students involved, working with children in schools, working with single parents, working with mayors, working with clergy. So everybody has some responsibility to lift us out of these challenges. These books are, in a sense, just a reminder. Here's the problem, but also here's some things that we can do collectively to address those problems. And that's what I hope people will take from them, and they will see that everyone can do and should do
like
something.
The phrase you use in lynch mobs, if you don't have moral courage, you can lose advances like affirmative action because they are being challenged.
That's exactly right. And when you think of moral courage, you think of Governor George Ryan, Republican, conservative, pro-death penalty. He had to go against all the prevailing notions in the state of Illinois to say, you know what, the system is broken. It's broken, and I can't allow it to go forward, and he did that. Think of Justice Anthony Kennedy, conservative, Republican, Supreme Court justice. He has been vilified by conservative Republicans because he wrote the opinion, not relying on, but embracing international principles of law to say that we cannot constitutionally execute youth under the age of 18. That took moral courage, because he said the law says this. That's different from the Brown case. Think about Brown case. They issued the right decision, but they put their finger on the scale saying, you can do this, but do it at your own pace. That's the lack of moral courage, as opposed to saying, you know what, we are really serious about ending segregation, and we're going to say the laws it has to end, and you have to do it now. And if not, come back and give us a reason why you can't do it, as opposed to you decide how much time it'll take. And once that weak link was in the armor, it was easy for the resistance to happen. So it's not just judges, but all of us have to have the moral courage to volunteer, to reach out, to go beyond our comfort zone, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked and the homeless, to educate the illiterate. Those are fundamental American values. And each and every citizen has to say, I too will stand up to do something. It's not about me, it's about my community. And the community is not just the blocks where I live, it's the city, it's the neighborhood, it's the state, it's the country. And when we came together as a community after September 11, 2001, it was remarkable how we put aside race, politics, age, class, and religion, and we said we're all here as patriots, waving the flag. You know, we're going to defend ourselves and protect ourselves. And now that has recessed somewhat, we're back to our old ways of taking care of ourselves, but not looking out for our community. And my argument in both these books is that we have to take the responsibility to make these communities better. It won't happen without us. And don't wait for the Supreme Court, don't wait for Messiah, don't wait for the president, but we as citizens have to do what the first revolutionary warriors did, right? If it's the Boston Tea Party or whatever they did, they had to say, we're going to stand up to be counted. And as Americans, we have to stand up to be counted in each and every place, each and every day, in each and every way.
As you point out in your two books, not to be blind, but to see. And not to turn away from, but to turn to. And address these issues with candor and figure out what needs to be done. Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
It's such a pleasure, and I just had a great time.